Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's not easy to sum up in just a few minutes what we are witnessing right now in Europe as far as migration pressure is concerned. I would very quickly go through some main aspects of the situation, or what we consider to be some of the main aspects of the situation, a few information and a brief outline of the trends we are seeing and the context and the situation that we are witnessing in Europe, an indication of some of the main challenges and implications that this situation is bringing about for European countries and for EU institutions, and some comments on the response that is being put in place. First of all, if we can go to the next slide, yeah. What are we seeing right now happening in Europe, and what we have been seeing for the last 2.5 years? First of all, we are seeing a situation that is very fluid and changing very rapidly. Changing very rapidly in terms of numbers. If you think that in 2014, when already the European Union and European member states were considering the migration pressure to be exceptional, in 2015 we have seen almost doubling the number of this pressure. So the situation is moving and changing very fast. Is a situation made of a mixed composition of flows. You have refugees, you have economic migrants, you have victims of trafficking, you have smuggled migrants, you have other type of vulnerability, you have a certain percentage, we'll see a bit more in detail later on, of minors and unaccompanied minors. So you have a mixed group of people, which already indicates that the response has to be tailored to the group that are crossing into the European states. Among this group of people, the percentage of vulnerable people, for various reasons, it's particularly high. And also is a composition that changes all the time. Depending on when you talk about it, you have a majority of refugees coming into Europe, then after a week you have a majority of non-refugees coming into Europe. And this composition of the flow keeps changing as the movement happens. What is important, and I'm happy that Ambassador Swing mentioned it, because I think it's very important and has been one of the main points that we have pushed as IOM all along. We don't consider this to be a crisis. And it is not a crisis because the numbers that are arriving into Europe, although are very high and very much higher than they were before, or traditionally, in terms of immigration and refugees arrival in Europe, those numbers do not justify, for the size of Europe, for the amount of resources that Europe has, for the level of sophistication that European society have, those numbers do not justify that we define the situation as a crisis. Europe has received this year so far a bit more than 100,000 people. It is expected more or less to reach the million by the end of 2015. This is still lower than the number of refugees from Syria that Jordan is hosting. But Jordan has 78 times a lower GDP than Europe. These are still lower numbers compared to what Lebanon is hosting. They are less than half of the refugees hosted in Turkey. And then if we move into other regions, it's still lower or comparable to the refugee population that Ethiopia has, or that Kenya has been hosting for 26 years, etc., etc. So this is not a crisis of number. What it has been a crisis of values and of systems. Of values, because the migration pressure has pushed Europe and some of its member states to put in question the fundamental values and the founding values on which the European political project is based. We hear now discussion on whether or not solidarity among EU member states is a principle that needs to be applied. We hear discussion on whether we have to be selective in our asylum systems and whether we should accept all that would qualify for protection under the 51 Convention, or whether we should be selective in terms of religion, for example, or in terms of nationality, discriminating between somebody in need of protection coming from country X and somebody else in need of international protection but having the luck of coming from country Y and therefore being accepted. So these are the fundamental values that right now are being rediscussed in Europe, in various fora, and in various political debate, and that is, in our view, the most worrying part of the crisis that Europe is going through. And the other aspect of the crisis that we have seen is clearly that the systems that we had in Europe to handle migratory pressure and asylum in general were not up to scratch when it came for an influx that was a bit higher than the usual relatively low number that Europe has been having in recent years after especially the end of the Balkan Wars, which was probably the last time that Europe witnessed a large influx of refugees on its territories. Those systems were obviously not capable of managing what has been happening. You have seen in the previous slide a few of the numbers. I'm not going to dwell too much on the numbers, also because, as I said, they change all the time, not just in terms of absolute number, but in terms of composition. This is just a snapshot to give you an idea of what happens in a standard week in some of the countries that are most affected. Greece, Italy, first as a country of first entry, and then first country of a secondary movement like Fyrom or Croatia. What is driving these people to move? The question that circulates very often, we can go ahead a couple of slides. The question that circulates very often in Europe in various meetings and discussion is why all of a sudden all these people are coming? Why until 2013 the number were relatively negligible in terms of arrival? Now in a year and a half we had such an explosion of number. Well, first of all, it's obviously not all of a sudden. It's accumulation of factors. Luca was mentioning the war in Syria with no end in sight. Has been going on for 5 years, so obviously that situation has been mounting and mounting and mounting in terms of pressure on the people that have fled Syria and are hosted in the neighboring country. There are various reasons and various drivers why the people are arriving to Europe. I would sum it up in one primarily, and that is the level of vulnerability that these people are experiencing. And then the vulnerability that they're experiencing, of course, is characterized by different specific situations. So if you are a Syrian, says, of course, the civil war and the situation of conflict that you have in Syria. If you are of some other country from the Horn of Africa, right now present on the EU territory without any legal basis to do so. The other option that they have aggressively to look into is to improve on the opening of legal channel for different categories of migrants, be it refugees. There are certain countries in Europe right now that have closed their border completely, so even a Syrian asylum seeker cannot get across and request asylum. So legal channel for refugees, legal channel for economic migrants to some extent, and the possibility for other vulnerable category of people to have a chance to legally come to Europe. Without that, we will always be going in circles. We will witness massive arrival, massive irregular arrival, we'll provide protection to the refugees, we'll send back the non-refugees, and we'll keep seeing massive arrival because of the same reason that haven't been tackled. I jump to the end of the presentation, where I actually will change the subject from what you will see on the slide. Just to check that you're actually following. Europe has been trying hard to equip itself to respond to this situation. has done so at the beginning with a certain degree of confusion. Some of the European friends present in the room might not be too happy to hear me say this, but I think it's fair to recognize it. Definitely the response at the very beginning of this increased pressure has not been extremely well coordinated among the EU member states and the EU institution, but gradually it has moved towards a more effective and more union-like response. I think what is important to underline in terms of what are the systemic responses that Europe is trying to put in place is two main elements. One, in April, for the first time in their history, the EU has come out with a joint EU migration agenda. So with a policy to manage migration across the territory of the Union based on shared principle and shared action. And that was the first step towards a common EU policy on migration that has been absent until now. There is no EU common policy on migration, there wasn't. And the second element that is of relevance is the whole process that led to the EU-African Union summit in Valletta a month ago. That was the first attempt, successful attempt, I have to say, to bring around the table heads of states and governments, both from the European Union and from the African Union, for 2 days to discuss exclusively about migration and reach a common understanding on a joint plan of action that is supposed to be implemented by the two regions in a coordinated and joint fashion. And also the European Union has come up with some mechanism to fund the activities that will be implemented under that plan of action. We have participated as IOM in the whole process preparing to Valletta. It's been a very difficult discussion among the two regions, but the fact that 57 heads of states and governments have actually signed off on a joint plan of action is obviously a welcome step forward. The challenge will be to make sure that the various elements of this plan of action, which is divided in 5 chapters, going from tackling the root causes to return and readmission, protection of rights, legal channel, and fight against smuggling and trafficking. The challenges will be that these 5 chapters be implemented in a balanced way, and not that the action plan is hijacked by excessive security concern or measures that are only aimed at reducing the inflow as much as possible, and that actually the attention to fighting the root causes and working on improving legal channel is strengthened and increased as much as possible. There is a lot to be done to build trust among the different regions involved in those complex flow. There are different and at times contradictory priorities between the two regions that need to be reconciled. I think this is the work that expects all of us in the next few months and possibly few years, if we have to be successful in bringing a proper system of management in these increased migration challenges and pressure that Europe is witnessing. The last word that I think is important, because we mention it but we at times don't pay enough attention to the risk, is for a variety of reasons that have to do with ineffective communication or with political calculation of certain political parties, and the lack of proper information among the public opinion on what migration actually is, means, and the level of what we are seeing in Europe effectively is. What we are witnessing more and more, not just in some election, but also in the discourse we hear in the streets, is a worrying, mounting level of xenophobia, which in many instances becomes plain clear racism. I think historically we have always been not attentive enough to the mounting of racism. If we stay in Europe and we go back to the early 30s, some of the discourse we hear today we were hearing already in the early 30s in a beer pub in Germany among a small group of people that then became a large group of people who was going around dressed with brown shirts. We have to be to guard very attentively against the mounting xenophobia and at times racism that we witness in our society, because these are mechanisms that very quickly assume a life of their own and then become much more difficult to counteract. We have to make sure that the basic principles on which our actions are based are reiterated, maintained, and applied courageously when it takes, and with all the efforts that are required by a situation that, as I said at the beginning, is not a crisis, but still require our full attention and our full support. I will close here, and I thank you very much.